The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Washington, D.C. and indeed the United States of America appear in turmoil. The Senate is anxious to get things done, but with only a vote advantage to the Democrats courtesy of Vice President Kamala Harris, and of course Senators Manchin and Sinema not willing to give up the filibuster, desperation and frustration abound. On top of this, we have President Joe Biden, whose popularity, once lauded as, if not impressive, at least stable, has started to tumble. What does all this portend for 2022 and beyond? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and for our show today, we'll be looking at the widely speculated talk of a Trump-DeSantis ticket in 2024 with writer and broadcaster Jeff Charles. Will it or won't it happen? And are the potential hopefuls wise to keep a lid on any news? We'll also be talking with economic guru Andrew Moran to ask that all-important question: have Democrats, and specifically President Biden, abandoned what was once considered received wisdom? It's the economy, stupid, when it comes to making a play for the votes. All this and more on Liberty Nation Radio. But first, let's hear what the big players have to say on Liberty Nation's signature Say What segment. Well, if it seems like you're living in bizarre world and all that once was is no more, you're not alone. Political watchers have been surprised to find that the long-held Democratic opposition to voter ID laws is no more. But not content with calling it a 180-degree volte-face, the Biden-friendly media is casting this as an evolution of their position rather than a flip-flop. But what could have presaged such a turnaround? The more skeptically minded of you out there may put it down to recent polling by Monmouth University that found that 8 out of 10 respondents want some form of voter ID at the ballot box. That figure includes 91% of Republicans, 89% of independents, and even 62% of Democrats. So with the public behind voter ID, what was a party that has spent decades against such a measure to do? Well, they had two options. Option one was to say, hey, we misjudged what you guys wanted, and we're here to deliver. Or option two was just to pretend that you never actually supported such a thing in the first place. One such senator opted for the "don't let your lying eyes fool you" option was new Georgia Senator Raphael Warnock, who, speaking to NBC, said, quote, "I have never been opposed to voter ID, and in fact, I don't know anybody who is," end quote. Well, that may come as a surprise to one Raphael Warnock from 2012, 2015, 2016, and even as far back in those heady days of 2021. Here's a short compilation of his views prior to the seismic shift in public opinion.
With these unnecessary and unjustifiable voter ID laws, which constitute, in my estimation, a poll tax. Dealing with these voter ID laws, this is not about voter verification. This is about voter suppression. All of these voter suppression laws saying we've got to have voter ID laws. This is Jim Crow in new clothes.
Sticking with Georgia, failed gubernatorial candidate and voting rights activist Stacey Abrams was one of the first to evolve her position without quite saying so. Here's Ms. Abrams' stated position on April 27th of this year.
Voters without a driver's license or state ID must surrender their personal information and risk identity theft just to receive an absentee ballot. And then there are the 200,000 Georgia voters who don't have either ID, and the putative free ID that is not free when you factor in the cost of transportation and the cost of underlying documents. You can read the full list of objections to SB 202 at stopjimcrow2.com.
Couldn't be much clearer, right? Now here's her position less than 2 months later on June 17th.
That's one of the fallacies of Republican talking points that have been deeply disturbing. No one has ever objected to having to prove who you are to vote. It's been part of our nation's history since the inception of voting.
It's almost as if some folks don't know the Internet Wayback Machine exists at all. But it's not only on this subject that the present government is having issues. With voter ID being presented as a racial issue, despite the overwhelming majority support in the American public for such a thing, including 84% of Black Americans, you might think that the Democratic Party politicians would have their racial ally credentials up to date. Not so for Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, who has come under mild fire for belonging to an exclusive club that has few, if any, minority members. Now, this was first noticed in 2017, and 4 years later, despite the Summer of Love, the racially charged rhetoric, and riots that swept the country, very little seems to have changed. Here's the senator dealing with questions that, if the mainstream media were serious, would be topping the front page of your papers this very day.
Back in 2017, you had expressed concerns about the membership of the all-white Bailey's Beach Club, said that you hoped it would become more diverse. Now, your family's been members, your wife is one of the largest shareholders. Has there been any traction in that? Are there any minority members of the club now?
I think the people who are running the place are still working on that, and I'm sorry it hasn't happened yet.
Do you have concerns in 2021? I mean, obviously, it's been 4 years. You had remarks on the floor following the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd saying, hoping to root out systemic racism in the country. Your thoughts on an elite, all-white, wealthy club, again, in this day and age? Should these clubs continue to exist?
It's a long tradition in Rhode Island, and there are many of them. I think we just need to work our way through the issues. Thank you.
And what of the Senate filibuster? A mechanism that has been used by both parties for a very long time, and an estimated 300 or more uses by the Democratic Party over the last several years alone. All of a sudden, the filibuster is tradition non grata. Could it be that with a 50-50 split in the Senate and a simple majority most often made possible by the input of Kamala Harris donning her hat as the president of the Senate for a tie-breaking vote, that Democrats are frustrated that they might need to make concessions to their Republican colleagues to enact any legislation that can't be pushed through with reconciliation? When you avail yourself of a congressional mechanism hundreds of times and then cry foul when your opposition uses it, there's a word for that. And it's a word that even the usually supportive Fourth Estate is coming dangerously close to applying to the party they often seem to be in favor of. We'll end with a bombshell. CNN's Jake Tapper seems more than a little astonished at these continuous flip-flops. Speaking to Senator Richard Blumenthal, here's the exchange on why the Connecticut senator now opposes the filibuster.
Democrats control the White House, they control the House, they control the Senate. I mean, what are you talking about? You're preventing billionaires from controlling politics. I mean, you guys control everything right now.
We may have an evenly divided Senate and control because the vice president can break a tie, but the filibuster rules, as the American people are beginning to understand, require us to have 60 votes just to proceed to debate, just to talk about the bill. And that's why a lot of us, including many of our leaders, believe that we should tremendously modify the filibuster. I'm in favor of abolishing it, but in the meantime, we can mobilize support among the American people to understand that dark money, the money that goes to elections without disclosure, is determining the outcomes, and that's what we need disclosure to shine a light on, and that's why this bill is so important, to end that kind of corruption.
Senator, haven't you voted in favor of filibustering Republican legislation, not allowing them to even proceed to a discussion, an amendment process, and debate on a bill?
We have used the 60-vote threshold a number of times. For example,
but you're talking about it being corrupt, but you've used it too.
And there you have it. It seems that even credibility can only be stretched so far. We'll be right back on Liberty Nation Radio after this short break.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. The topic under discussion today is what lies ahead for the Republican Party in terms of 2022, 2024, and beyond. The question on everybody's lips regarding Donald J. Trump is, will he or won't he? To help us delve into the latest figures, facts, and perhaps a little fortune-telling is LibertyNation.com author Jeff Charles. Welcome, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Now, Jeff, it seems almost certain that if President Trump chose to run again, he'd secure the party nomination, and probably within the first third of states. But that doesn't appear to mean that he's the only viable candidate. What numbers are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, a recent straw poll at a conservative conference had Florida Governor Ron DeSantis edging out Trump by a few percentage points. So he was the front runner according to that study. So if Trump decides not to run, I mean, the front runner could very easily be Governor Ron DeSantis. But in the top 5, you also had people like Ted Cruz. You had Tim Scott. I mean, there are other contenders who could take up the mantle if Trump decides not to run. And what's interesting is that that all of these people are at the very least friendly to the MAGA or America First movement.
Yeah, very much so. It seems that those who are not so much behind the America First brigade, that they were polling dead last in that. And now this is a straw poll, so it's not overly scientific. However, these are people who would take part in this kind of poll. These are people who will go out and vote. Is that right?
Yes, indeed. And yeah, it may not be scientific, but I mean, anybody who's been paying attention to what's been going on the right is not surprised by this, right? I mean, the establishment is taking a back seat now, and you are seeing the more populist America First movement take over the reins, essentially. So I wouldn't be surprised if they did more of these polls and got similar results, because that's just the way that the conservative movement is going right now.
You'd imagine, although we have possibly learned our lesson that polls are not always reliable, but you never know. They do often indicate trends. So as you mentioned earlier, Ron DeSantis, he is most definitely what one would call an America First candidate. Now, why is it that the non-America First candidates, do you think, are doing so poorly at the moment?
The answer is really simple, Mark. I mean, the establishment, they had their chance. They got more of a chance than they deserved. They were in control for decades, and they squandered the opportunity. They took every opportunity. They took every opportunity to miss opportunities. So, I mean, Obamacare is one example. They swore up and down that they were going to repeal Obamacare and replace it with something that relied more on the free market. What happened when they had controls of both chambers of Congress and the Oval Office? Nothing. That's just one example of how badly they've messed this situation up. And this just shift that we're seeing now has been a long time coming. It was inevitable. I mean, we saw it with the Tea Party, and now that's kind of morphed into what we're seeing today. And the establishment is going to take a back seat. And while there are some in the establishment who do want to work with the America First movement and the MAGA movement, they read the tea leaves, they know what's going on. There are some that are just going to be stubborn and get left behind and probably lose their seats.
So they're reading the Tea Party leaves, as you say, Jeff. Now, I'd like to delve a little bit deeper here. It seems that the more activist media and the Democrats are getting a carte blanche to go after Donald Trump. But if the candidate come 2024 is not Donald Trump, they'll have to pivot to going after the America First agenda. Now, to me, this seems like it may not be the smartest move possible, but nonetheless an almost inevitable one, almost as if they'll have to start playing the ball rather than playing the man. What are your thoughts on that, Jeff?
You know, I think it is inevitable, although I have a feeling, I have a sneaking suspicion that even if Trump is not the nominee, if he decides not to run, I think that they're still going to try to tie this to Trump, because they think that Trump is so toxic that putting him in the equation will tank the chances of a GOP victory. They're wrong, but I do think that that's what they'll try. These people can't let go of Trump. They love him. So, I mean, as much as they say they hate him, they love him. So they're not so even if he doesn't run, they're still going to try to make him the focus as much as possible. But I do agree that they're going to have to adjust the strategy, even if they're trying to put Trump into it and go after the overall movement. The problem is that they don't really understand the right. They don't understand the conservative movement. So a lot of stuff they say they're going to get wrong. They're going to lie, and it's going to be very easy to expose that lie. On top of that, Biden's presidency has been an utter disaster.
Well, Joe Biden's record will certainly be on the ballot ticket come 2022, which, as we know, because both of us have done math, comes before 2024. And with that all-important midterms. So, Jeff, what's your analysis of how a potential Trump-DeSantis ticket, or DeSantis running with the approval of Donald Trump, or Donald Trump running and DeSantis not being on that ticket, how could the information of those two being deemed the future of the Republican Party sway the balance of power for the midterms? Or if such a matchup is on the horizon, are they better off keeping quiet about it until after the midterm results come in? What are your thoughts?
So what I think is going to happen, I think they are going to keep coy about it until after the midterm elections. And I do think that that's the smart move. Republicans stand to get some serious gains in the House and in the Senate in 2022, especially with the way Biden's presidency is going. Like I said before, it's been an utter disaster. He hasn't even gotten out of his first year yet, and we're dealing with a huge border crisis. We're dealing with hostilities in the Middle East. We're dealing with abhorrent jobless rates. And on top of that, the Democrats are trying to push through a very radical agenda that is only being stopped by Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. So it's only going to get worse for the Democrats. I don't expect this trend to stop. I mean, Biden's not going to turn it around. There's going to be another crisis after the next, and his team is going to mishandle it. So at this point, there doesn't seem to be a need to possibly shake things up by announcing a presidential candidate before the midterm. So I think they will wait until after, and then they'll assess what happened, and then they'll go forward from there.
One of President Joe Biden's main themes, both on the campaign trail and within his first couple of months in office, was unity. And now we haven't quite seen that stretch across the aisle in the chambers of Congress. But do you think that there'll be some unifying faction if the Democrats have a united target to aim at? And could that be why the GOP, Republicans and Conservatives are keeping a little more quiet on who they want to run in 2024? Because if there's a unifying figure, that gives the Democrat Party a chance to coalesce against that, which does give the aura of unity.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, and it's interesting that you bring that up, because a few weeks ago, there was a report that Democratic operatives were talking about how they were going to make people like Marjorie Taylor Greene their big villain. They need a villain. I mean, and both sides do this. This is part of politics. They need a villain. So right now they're talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene. I'm sure they'll loop in some others as well. But that's yet another reason to keep quiet about it until later, because you don't want to give them a major figure to coalesce around as far as attacking them. Let the progressive wing and the establishment wing of the Democratic Party continue to fight with one another. Right now, there isn't that much unity on that side. And I don't think that going after Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to work. They need a powerhouse. They need somebody at the presidential level. They need a Trump. They need a DeSantis. They need a figurehead on the right to go after. And right now, they don't really have it.
They did try and go after Senator Cruz for a little while, especially Cancun Cruz. But I think what you say about Marjorie Taylor Greene is probably spot on, but it's in the same way that Republicans have also targeted Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, in that they've created somebody who is almost a parody of the real person, and it makes for wonderful headlines, it makes for wonderful Twitter memes, but in terms of substance and actually uniting the party in form of this is the kind of policy we need to oppose rather than this the type of person we need to oppose, I don't think it's done very well for either side. Jeff Charles, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
And we'll be back with Liberty Nation just after this quick break.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear for your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
With massive spending bills on the horizon and a seemingly endless urge to spend taxpayer dollars, the federal government appears to have roundly rejected the adage of, "It's the economy, stupid," when it comes to seeking votes in 2022. Now, has Joe Biden got a fiscal plan up his sleeve for his party to hold on to power in the upper and lower chambers? Or is he banking on wokeness over wages? To help us unravel all this is Liberty Nation's economic correspondent and author of The War on Cash, Andrew Moran. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So, Andrew, what's the latest financial, economic, and job figures, and what kind of impact are they having on the average American?
Yeah, so the latest numbers today for measuring the labor market would be the initial jobless claims data for the second consecutive week. The number of Americans filing for unemployment benefits topped 400,000 before the pandemic. To put this into perspective, the figure was around 200,000 a week, so it's more than double. But at the same time, it is better than it was at the height of the pandemic, which was around 700,000 or 800,000 a week. So at the same time, the upside is that the number of job openings in the United States today is at an all-time high. So anyone terminated from their position would probably have a treasure trove of options at their disposal. But of course, at the same time, you have this issue where people are not seeking those jobs because they're comfortable with those federal benefits they're getting from Uncle Biden. So whether or not they seek those positions is a different story. And for a broader gauge of the economy, some of the recent measurements have been decent. You have the producer price indexes are beating expectations. The final GDP reading came out this morning for the first quarter, and it was, it matched expectations. And the durable goods orders have held steady. So of all these numbers, of course, for the average American, the jobs data is the most important one. The economy is coming out of this pandemic, so it's better to take a more of a long-term wait-and-see approach to see what's going on as opposed to month over month. But this is U.S. politics, so we don't really focus on the long-term, focus on what's best for tomorrow's vote.
Apples today, apples tomorrow. We'll be coming back to those job figures, I think, later on, Andrew. I just want to know, what of the ever-present specter of inflation? Now, I've heard from different sources within the government that A, there will be no inflation, B, there will be transitory inflation, or C, that's just short-lived inflation, I guess, or C, that inflation is about to go through the roof. Now, they can't all be true. What's your analysis?
Yeah. I wrote about this recently with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. She finally conceded that, inflation is going to be here until next year. So I really enjoyed this evolution of everyone's take on inflation. As you mentioned, it started from, saying, when they passed the CARES Act and when the Fed launched this unlimited quantitative easing push, it went from, there's not going to be any inflation going on. What are you crazy? And then it went to, inflation could be here, but it's going to be brief and it's going to be, small. And then it says, inflation is going to be here, but if it's high, it's going to be short-lived. And now it's, inflation is going to be here, and it's going to be until 2022, and it's going to be higher, but after that, it's probably going to come down. So it's been mind-numbing to see the constant flip. Liberty Nation, we've been reporting since the start of the pandemic about the inflation tsunami that would be coming, and lo and behold, it's starting to make tidal waves in the United States. And this happens when you create 1/4 of all U.S. dollars ever printed. It's inevitable that you get these inflation numbers that you're seeing, and there's more to come. At the same time, to give the Federal Reserve, I guess, some credit, there are other factors at play here. You have the shrinking supplies like soybean and corn. You have global simultaneous demand across the globe, and then you have this, you have limited inventories as it is. But these inflation measurements that the government's giving you, they pale in comparison to what's really going on. When you really dive into, I think it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics data or the Census Bureau data, and you see the things that people need, they're the ones that becoming really expensive: meat, shelter, whatever the case. The things that people need to go day to day, those prices are skyrocketing 5%, 6%, 10%. I think I saw eggs the other day. I think it's up 12%. So, inflation, that's gonna be the main theme of the Biden administration. As soon as he gets in office, inflation skyrocketing. Now, would it have been better if it was former President Trump? Of course not, because he presided over such massive spending. QE started under him, so it would have been any different under Trump. But since it's Biden, he's the president. Everyone thinks that the president is the commander of the economy. It falls at his feet.
Well, that's something I want to dig a little bit deeper into here, Andrew, politically. So the 2022 midterms, they're all important for the Democratic Party, obviously, especially with the historical regularity but bar several notable exceptions with which the leading party tends to lose seats. So they have razor-thin majorities in both chambers right now that could easily fall to the Republicans next year. Now, why do you think that the party has swept away the wisdom of "it's the economy, stupid" when it comes to how they think people will vote?
Well, I think it's because they have an abysmal record on the economy. So, perhaps they don't want to put up too much of a spotlight on their record, or maybe just members of the Democratic Party, as well as the Republican Party, of course, they're ignorant of economics. Or maybe there's, as you said in your intro, they're just too woke and they're fixated on gender pronouns, or perhaps they're still distraught from the January 6th event. So who knows what playbook they're running from? The likely scenario is that they know these policies put forward will only do more harm than good. They might offer a short-term remedy. You saw that with the stimulus checks. Provided huge retail sales boost, personal spending jumped, and then when the stimulus checks were exhausted, retail sales went down, personal spending went down. So these are all just short-term fixes to and then so long-term, it's not going to be good of what's going on, especially as we mentioned with the inflation.
Yeah, I want to jump into that quickly a little bit, Andrew, if I may.
Okay.
So I can see the logic of focusing away from the economy when people are receiving numerous stimulus checks and extra benefits. But President Biden recently tweeted that, and I'm going to quote it here for you. "Today's job report shows that historic progress for American families and the American economy. We added 559,000 jobs in May, created a record 2 million jobs in our first 4 months, and unemployment is at its lowest level since the pandemic started." Now, really, this sounds like supremely positive news, but is the devil in the detail?
Yeah, well, of course, this is what happens when you reopen the economy. Of course, you're going to have, great job creation or better job numbers than you had, at the height of the public health crisis. So if you open the economy, of course, people are going to go back to their jobs. People are going to start participating in the economy. So it's not that it's some, magical wisdom of Keynesian economics or Bidenomics or, the genius of Kamala Harris. It's just you open the economy, you're going to have these numbers. But, when you start diving deeper into numbers, that's when you have some sort of, confusion going on, because employment is still way below of what it was before the pandemic. You still have, think of something like 10 million fewer Americans are still, are employed than they were before the pandemic. Personal spending has been on the decline since as I noted, the stimulus checks were exhausted. And then not to mention, of course, the surging costs of living. I think that's going to be the major point that the Republicans are going to emphasize on heading into the midterm elections, because people worry about their pocketbook. No matter how much you focus on he, ze, her, whatever those gender pronouns are, people care more about the dollar bills in their pockets and how much they're paying at the supermarket for their meat and eggs. And the quieter the party is on the economy, the better chance the media wing of the Democratic Party will pay less attention to it, thus deceiving a considerable portion of voters who think, the economy is good, it's going okay, it was all because of Trump. Now Biden here, it's been 100 and something days since he's been president, so he's doing his best to do it. But then of course, or to fix it, and then reality steps in. Come voting day, people are going to say, well, the Democrats aren't that great on the economy. When Trump was president before the pandemic, we had all these jobs and we had all this economic prosperity. So maybe I should vote for the Republicans.
Well, that brings us nicely on to our last question, Andrew. I'm going to ask you to either play Cassandra and or Nostradamus, whichever you prefer. How do you see the economy for Americans in the run-up to 2022?
Well, I'm sure if you watch CNBC or Bloomberg, you probably hate that word inflation by now, because that's what everyone seems to be talking about. But the inflationary economy is here. That's going to be the defining moment or defining economic development for President Biden. The cost of everything that people need will climb higher in 2022 or the rest of the year and in 2022. The stock market will probably continue to climb, because of the accommodative monetary policy. So interest rates at record lows. You still have money printing going on. You have the bond buying program unlikely to subside anytime soon. The labor market will probably continue to expand, but at a slower pace. But I think that a good example of what's going to happen with Biden what happened to Obama when he became president and the post-recession recovery is that Biden is probably going to preside over a slow economic recovery. If you remember during the Obama days, the things by the time he left office, he had the second or third slowest economic recovery in the nation's history following a recession. So, mourning in Biden's America? I think not.
Andrew Moran peering into the crystal ball of economic America. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll be back after this break with Liberty Nation Radio.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
With just 5 months under his belt as president, Joe Biden has begun to feel the inevitable withdrawal of goodwill that often accompanies the honeymoon days of any new presidency. That this traditional grace period has lasted longer than the usual 100 days is most likely a result of media fascination and an ebullient population glad to be free of COVID lockdowns. But the salad days are over, and the pollsters are hungry. Monmouth University polling gives the president an approval rating of just 48%. This is significant not only because it marks a low point in a fairly steady decline in popularity, but also because poll collators regard Monmouth as a gold standard. 538, for example, considers it the only grade A poll of the last 2 months. So what do these numbers really suggest? Well, according to Monmouth, the president gets a positive rating from 86% of Democrats, which is down from 95%. 36% of independents, which is down from 47%, and 19% of Republicans, which surprisingly is up from just 11%. So his overall approval is down 9% with his own party, 11% with independents. In fact, the only positive result he received was from Republicans, plus 8%. Do the numbers suggest that the bump from GOP voters is because Biden's presidency so far has not been as radical as this group originally thought it would be? This could explain the relative loss of support from Democrat voters also. Another poll, this one from the Des Moines Register Mediacom Iowa, gives the president just a 43% approval with 52% disapproving. Now, back in March, this same pollster awarded Biden a +3 approval rating. So what happened? Well, with largely positive media coverage of the commander-in-chief's overseas adventures, it may be his domestic agenda that is tanking the figures. Consider the recent furore over voting law reforms, which we spoke of earlier. Cracks are starting to appear in the hitherto reasonably united Democratic Party front that opposes an ID requirement to cast a ballot, something that has long been used as a stick with which to beat the opposition. Failed Georgia gubernatorial candidate and electoral reform advocate Stacey Abrams recently seemed to do a full 180 on her previous stance that voter ID laws are discriminatory and racist. Prominent news outlets were quick to ignore the volte-face, instead insisted that it was an evolution of policy rather than a flip. By positioning his administration against such a publicly unifying idea, the president would be made to look both out of touch and reckless regarding voter integrity. The right to vote has been a hard-won battle for many, and the idea that either fraud or maladministration may nullify an individual's vote is anathema to the American public. Perhaps it's avoiding this particular reality that has so tarnished the president's once lauded approval numbers. And then there's the issue of gun control, that with every election cycle becomes bigger and bigger and more important to those who support a strong Second Amendment, and equally important in another respect to those who don't want guns in the hands of citizens at all. The President and Attorney General Merrick Garland outlined a number of measures on June 23rd that they feel will check the explosion in crime rate that they predict will be coming in the summer months. While much debate will doubtless ensue on the constitutionality, specificity, and scope of the proposed actions, commentators have already launched an opening salvo to deride President Biden's understanding of firearm ownership in America, both present day and from an historical perspective. The president said that his strategy would work on strengthening background checks, banning what he terms assault rifles, community policing, and a ban on high-capacity magazines. He said, "Talk to most reasonable gun owners, and they'll tell you there's no possible justification for having 100 rounds in a magazine. Well, that's certainly possible. Anyone who's ever tried to use a 100-round magazine, or a Mickey Mouse magazine, as they're less affectionately known, will tell you that they're just not that usable. But that's a matter of functionality rather than desirability. He also outlined that gun dealers who sell to customers who are not eligible to own firearms or who refuse to cooperate with tracing requests from the ATF will be targeted. Biden said, quote, "If you willfully sell a gun to someone who's prohibited from possessing it, if you willfully fail to run a background check, if you willfully falsify a record, my message to you is this: we'll find you and we will seek your license to sell guns," end quote. Well, President Biden, it may come as a surprise to you and the Attorney General, but there are already measures in place to stop folks knowingly selling firearms to those who are not allowed to have them. They're called laws, and they are already here. So what precisely is he trying to accomplish? Critics are arguing, based on the president's own words, that he's failed to understand the historical and legal significance of the Second Amendment. A short excerpt from the president's speech appears to display some fundamental misunderstandings.
The Second Amendment, from the day it was passed, limited the type of people who could own a gun and what type of weapon you could own. You couldn't buy a cannon. Those who say the blood of patriots, and all the stuff about how we're going to have to move against the government. Well, the tree of liberty is not water with the blood of patriots. What's happened is that there never been, if you wanted to think you need to have weapons to take on the government, you need F-15s and maybe some nuclear weapons. The point is that there's always been the ability to rationally limit the type of weapon that can be owned and who can own it.
As you heard, Biden stated that from the day it was passed, the Second Amendment limited the type of people who could own a gun and what type of weapon you could own. At the time of its writing, the people who could not own firearms were slaves and Native Americans, a policy that's now rightly deemed discriminatory and one that today's America would likely not seek to emulate. In terms of what weapons could be owned, the intent was that the weaponry would keep pace with the time. In fact, many of the ships and cannons employed during the American Revolution were privately owned, demonstrating that individuals were not only allowed, but expected to hold arms of equal power to that of the government. Many would acknowledge that modern capabilities have outstripped what the public is able to access in terms of firepower, but the commander-in-chief also said, if you think you need to have weapons to take on the government, you need F-15s and maybe some nuclear weapons. And perhaps unsurprisingly, this sparked a backlash from what some deem threatening language. The National Rifle Association, the NRA, was quick to respond, suggesting that Biden's measures were little more than a distraction from the true causes of rising crime. NRA spokeswoman Amy Hunter, she said, quote, "This is a political red herring aimed at hiding the real and abysmal failures of the Biden administration. Crime rates are high because of the efforts to defund the police and a failure to prosecute career criminals. The simple fact is, strict enforcement of existing laws, including gun laws, coupled with the support of law enforcement and prosecutors to do their jobs, would result in a dramatic decrease in crime. But the president would rather play politics than make Americans safer." End quote. The president justified his stance by saying, "We're not changing the Constitution, we're enforcing it." Now, this sentiment will certainly be debated in both the media realm and the courts of America. But whether Joe Biden is right or wrong that his measures will result in less crime certainly remains to be seen. One consequence almost guaranteed is that many Americans who cherish the Second Amendment rights will see this as government overreach, and rather than an added enforcement of the Constitution, as an attack against it. It seems President Biden just can't catch a break, whether it's a volte-face on voting, hypocrisy from his party on the filibuster, failing to understand the Constitution. It all seems to have caught up with the man who would be king. That's all we have time for on this edition of Liberty Nation Radio, right here on the Radio American Network. I want to thank our guests, Jeff Charles and Andrew Moran. But most of all, I want to thank you, the listeners, for loaning me your time and attention. Until next time, I wish you the very best in your continued pursuit of freedom and liberty. Thank you.